there's a question that sits underneath almost every painful moment in these relationships, one that rarely gets asked directly, because the immediate pain of the moment usually crowds it out. Not "how could they do this to me?" which tends to focus entirely on the specific incident. Something deeper and more unsettling: why does hurting me seem to matter to them at all? Why does causing pain, sometimes deliberate, sometimes almost casual in its cruelty, appear to serve some function in their internal world, one significant enough that they keep returning to it, sometimes across years, sometimes across multiple relationships, as though it's meeting some genuine, ongoing need? This is what we're exploring today, and I want to be honest about something before we go further, because this topic touches something considerably deeper and more uncomfortable than most of what we've covered throughout this series. What we're examining isn't simply another manipulation tactic to recognize and defend against. It's the actual, hidden mechanism underneath so many of those tactics, the thing this entire psychological structure works so hard to keep concealed, not just from you, but from almost everyone in their life, and often, most thoroughly of all, from themselves. Let's start by dismantling a common assumption, because it's the assumption that keeps this entire mechanism hidden in the first place: the belief that a narcissist hurts you because they don't care about the impact, because your pain simply doesn't register or matter to them the way it would to someone with genuine empathy. This assumption feels intuitive, and in some surface sense, it isn't entirely wrong. But it misses something considerably more specific and more revealing about what's actually happening underneath the behavior. Something that explains not just the absence of care, but the presence of something else entirely, something this entire structure has enormous investment in keeping hidden. Here's the truth worth sitting with directly, the one this exploration's title refers to. For many narcissists, causing pain isn't simply an indifferent byproduct of pursuing their own needs. It's often, whether consciously understood or not, a way of regulating an unbearable internal experience they have almost no other tools for managing, an internal experience built around a specific, corrosive belief they've spent their entire lives working to avoid confronting directly, the belief that they are fundamentally, irreparably insufficient, unworthy of the love and admiration their entire personality has been constructed to constantly extract from everyone around them. This is worth explaining precisely, because it's easy to hear this and mistake it for an excuse, which isn't what we're offering here. Understanding a mechanism doesn't excuse the harm it produces, but understanding it accurately does explain something that otherwise remains genuinely confusing: why hurting you specifically, someone who has likely loved them generously, someone who has extended patience and understanding far beyond what most people would offer, seems to happen with such strange, disproportionate frequency, often specifically during moments when you've gotten closest to seeing them clearly, or closest to genuine intimacy that would require real vulnerability from them in return. Let's talk about the actual mechanism at work here, because it's worth understanding as a specific, identifiable process rather than a vague psychological explanation. Remember everything we've traced throughout this entire series about the fragile core underneath narcissistic defenses, an underlying sense of self that cannot tolerate direct contact with shame without collapsing into some form of self-protection. Here's what's worth adding to this understanding now. The piece that explains the specific function hurting you actually serve as causing pain in someone else, particularly someone whose opinion and presence matter enormously to them, functions as a way of externalizing an unbearable internal state, converting something they cannot tolerate feeling themselves into something happening to someone else instead. This is worth explaining through a specific common pattern, because it illustrates the mechanism clearly. Consider a moment of genuine intimacy, a moment where you've seen something real and vulnerable in them, or a moment where they've begun to feel genuinely dependent on your presence in a way that touches something they've spent their whole life defending against feeling toward anyone. This kind of moment, paradoxically, often produces cruelty rather than closeness immediately afterward. This isn't random or coincidental timing. Genuine intimacy requires tolerating exactly the kind of exposure this entire psychological structure was built to avoid, the risk of being truly seen and found insufficient. Rather than tolerating this exposure directly, the discomfort gets converted, often within hours, into some form of coldness, criticism, or deliberate hurt directed at you, effectively transferring the unbearable internal experience of vulnerability onto someone else, where it becomes considerably easier to manage from a position of apparent control rather than genuine exposure. This is worth understanding as the actual, hidden truth underneath so much of what we've traced throughout this entire series. Hurting you isn't primarily about you at all, even in moments when it feels intensely, specifically targeted at your exact vulnerabilities. It's a regulation strategy, a way of converting an intolerable internal state into an external event they can, at least temporarily, feel some sense of control over, precisely because they're the one causing it rather than the one experiencing it directly. Let's talk about why this mechanism specifically targets people who love them deeply, rather than people whose opinion genuinely doesn't matter to them, because this is worth understanding clearly, and it explains something that confuses almost everyone who has been on the receiving end of this pattern. Causing pain in someone whose opinion doesn't matter produces no relief, because there's no underlying discomfort connected to that person's perception in the first place. The mechanism only produces the temporary regulation this psychology is unconsciously seeking when it's directed at someone whose love, whose closeness, whose accurate perception genuinely threatens the exact vulnerability being defended against. This is precisely why the people who receive the most cruelty in these relationships are so often the people who loved most deeply, who saw most clearly, who got closest to the exact intimacy this entire structure exists to prevent, not because their love mattered less, but because it mattered considerably more, and mattering that much is exactly what made them the target this mechanism needed. What we haven't yet explored is what this specific insight actually reveals about the deepest layer of this hidden truth, why this mechanism becomes considerably more compulsive and considerably less controllable during periods of genuine relational stability rather than instability, and what all of this actually means for how you understand what happened to you, not as random cruelty, but as something considerably more specific, and in its own painful way, considerably more revealing about exactly what this psychology has spent an entire lifetime hiding from everyone, including, most thoroughly, itself. Let's go deeper into something worth naming directly here, because it explains a pattern that confuses almost everyone who has lived through this kind of relationship, why this mechanism intensifies specifically during periods of genuine stability, rather than during periods of obvious conflict or crisis. This seems backward at first, because most people assume cruelty would increase when a relationship is already strained, when tension is already high, when something has already gone visibly wrong. But the actual pattern tends to run in the opposite direction, and understanding why requires returning to the mechanism we established in Part 1. Remember what we traced regarding intimacy specifically triggering this cycle, because stability functions almost identically. A period of genuine calm, genuine closeness, genuine trust building steadily over time, represents exactly the kind of sustained exposure this psychological structure has the least capacity to tolerate. Crisis and conflict, paradoxically, offer a strange kind of relief, because during crisis, attention gets organized around the external problem rather than the internal vulnerability that stability would otherwise leave unprotected and exposed. This is worth understanding as genuinely counterintuitive, but remarkably consistent across these dynamics. The calmer and more secure a relationship becomes, the more likely it is that something will happen to disrupt it, not because disruption is being consciously sought, but because sustained calm requires sustained exposure to genuine closeness. And genuine closeness is precisely the condition this entire defensive structure was built to prevent from lasting too long. This explains something worth naming directly, because it reframes a pattern many people have lived through without fully understanding its actual source, the sense that things were genuinely good, genuinely stable, right before everything fell apart again, seemingly without warning or adequate explanation. This isn't actually without explanation. The stability itself was the trigger, not because anything was wrong with the stability, but because the stability represented exactly the kind of sustained vulnerability this psychology has almost no tools for tolerating past a certain threshold. The disruption that follows, whether it's manufactured conflict, sudden coldness, or outright cruelty, functions as a release valve, converting unbearable internal exposure back into something more familiar and, paradoxically, more manageable. External conflict, distance, or your pain, rather than their own unprotected vulnerability. Let's talk about the deepest layer of this hidden truth now, because it's worth naming plainly rather than continuing to circle around it indirectly. The specific belief this entire mechanism exists to protect against, the one buried underneath every defense, every manipulation, every instance of cruelty we've traced throughout this entire series, is almost always some version of the same core conviction: I am not enough. And if you truly saw me, truly knew me, truly understood me completely, you would eventually leave, the same way everyone eventually leaves once they see clearly enough. This belief often formed extraordinarily early, frequently rooted in genuine childhood experiences of conditional love, inconsistent care, or environments where authentic vulnerability was met with punishment rather than comfort. becomes the organizing principle around which this entire adult personality structure gets built. This is worth understanding as genuinely different from an excuse, and it's worth being precise about this distinction, because it matters enormously for how you carry this understanding forward. So explaining where this belief comes from doesn't transfer responsibility for the harm it produces away from the person causing that harm. Countless people carry similarly painful early experiences without becoming capable of deliberately or repeatedly hurting the people who love them most. The explanation illuminates the mechanism without excusing the choice to let that mechanism operate unexamined, indefinitely, at someone else's expense. What this understanding does offer, though, is something considerably more useful than excuse-accurate insight into what you were actually witnessing and what you were never actually responsible for causing or fixing. Here's what's worth understanding about why this belief remains so thoroughly hidden, even from the person carrying it, because this explains why genuine self-awareness about this mechanism is so rare. Even among narcissists who've spent considerable time in therapy or engaged in extensive self-reflection, directly confronting this belief, I am fundamentally insufficient and unlovable once truly seen, requires tolerating exactly the shame this entire structure was built to avoid in the first place. It's not simply that this belief is difficult to admit to other people. It's that consciously registering it internally produces exactly the collapse the psychology has spent an entire lifetime avoiding, which means the belief itself often remains genuinely unconscious, so operating powerfully in the background while never actually surfacing into anything resembling clear, examined awareness. This is worth sitting with directly, because it explains something important about why the cruelty we've traced throughout this exploration so often feels, in the moment it's happening, it's genuinely disconnected from any coherent internal logic the narcissists themselves could actually articulate if asked. If you've ever confronted someone with the question, "Why did you do that? Why did you say that?" and received an answer that felt hollow, inadequate, or completely disconnected from the actual severity of what happened, this disconnection is genuine, not evasive in every case. The actual mechanism driving the behavior operates below the level of conscious access, which means even a moment of apparent honesty rarely reaches the real, hidden belief actually organizing the entire pattern. This brings us to the final and most important part of this exploration, the one where we need to address directly what this deepest understanding actually means for you. Now that you understand not just the mechanism, but the specific hidden belief this entire structure has always been protecting, and why this understanding, painful as it is to fully absorb, should ultimately relocate the weight of what happened to you exactly where it always belonged, and finally release you from carrying any part of it that was never actually yours to hold. Let's bring this all the way home, because everything we've traced across this exploration, the fragile core, the conversion of internal shame into external cruelty, the intensification during stability rather than crisis, and the deeply hidden belief of fundamental insufficiency underneath it all, points toward a single, final understanding worth sitting with carefully. If hurting you was never actually about you, if it was always underneath everything, a way of managing an unbearable internal belief they've spent their entire life avoiding, then something important shifts about how you're allowed to carry what happened between you. Here's what's worth naming directly, because it's the piece that actually matters most for your own healing, rather than simply for your understanding of their psychology. You were never actually the problem this mechanism was responding to. The mechanism would have activated with almost anyone who got close enough, loved deeply enough, saw clearly enough to trigger the exact vulnerability it exists to protect against. This isn't a comforting abstraction offered to soften something that shouldn't be softened. It's an accurate description of how this specific psychological structure actually operates, verified across countless different relationships, countless different partners, countless different specific circumstances that all somehow produce remarkably similar patterns once genuine intimacy and stability are reached. This matters enormously for something we've touched on throughout other explorations in this series, but deserves direct restating here: the specific self-blame that tends to linger long after these relationships end. The quiet, persistent wondering about what you could have done differently, what version of yourself might have finally been enough to prevent the cruelty, what different approach might have kept things stable instead of watching stability itself become the trigger for everything falling apart again. Understanding the mechanism we've traced throughout this entire exploration directly answers this lingering question. And the answer is worth stating plainly: there was no different version of you that would have prevented this. The trigger was never your specific behavior. It was your genuine presence, your genuine love, your genuine closeness, exactly the things that made you valuable rather than deficient, converted by a mechanism entirely outside your control into the exact catalyst for harm you spent so long trying to understand and prevent. Let's talk about what this means for how you relocate responsibility, because this is genuinely the most important practical outcome available from everything we've traced throughout this entire exploration. Responsibility for choosing to let an unexamined mechanism operate at someone else's expense, repeatedly across years, sometimes across multiple relationships, belongs entirely to the person carrying that mechanism, regardless of how deeply rooted its origins might be in their own early experience. This distinction matters enormously, and it's worth stating with real precision. Having an explanation for behavior is never the same as that behavior being excused or justified. Countless people carry difficult, painful histories without choosing to repeatedly hurt the people who love them most. The choice to let this mechanism continue operating unexamined, to avoid the genuine work that might eventually interrupt it, to prioritize temporary internal relief over someone else's genuine well-being again and again, remains entirely permanently theirs, not something their history absolves them of choosing. This is worth understanding as the final piece that allows you to hold both truths simultaneously, without either one canceling out the other. Their cruelty came from somewhere real, rooted in genuine pain they likely never chose to carry in the first place, and their cruelty was also, entirely, their responsibility to manage differently than they did, a responsibility they consistently failed to meet, at real lasting cost to you. Both of these things are true at once. Neither one requires you to abandon the other, and holding them together, rather than collapsing into either pure sympathy that excuses everything or pure anger that refuses to understand anything, is what actually allows this understanding to become useful, rather than simply another form of confusion. Here's the deepest insight worth carrying forward from everything we've traced across this entire exploration. It's the one that ties together not just this specific video, but so much of what this entire series has been building toward from its very beginning. The truth this psychology hides from everyone, the one buried underneath every defense, every manipulation, every instance of cruelty we've examined throughout this series, was never actually a secret about you. It was always a secret about them. It's about a belief so unbearable it required an entire lifetime of elaborate psychological architecture just to keep from ever being consciously, directly faced. You spent time, possibly years, believing you were somehow failing to be enough for someone whose entire pain, from the very beginning, was actually rooted in their own conviction that they themselves were the one who could never be enough. A conviction so unbearable that hurting you became easier than ever risking you discovering it was true. So if you've spent time wondering what was fundamentally wrong with you, what you could have done differently, what version of yourself might have finally kept things stable, instead of watching cruelty repeatedly interrupt whatever peace you'd managed to build together, let this be what you carry forward from everything we've explored throughout this entire series. There was never a better version of you waiting to be discovered that would have solved this. The mechanism was never about your adequacy. It was always about theirs, carried privately, defended fiercely, and expressed tragically through harm to exactly the people whose love came closest to proving the fear wrong. If only it had ever been allowed to be believed instead of defended against. You don't need to carry their unexamined fear as though it were evidence about your own worth. It was never yours to carry in the first place. It was always, from the very beginning, entirely, permanently theirs.